Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I am an old white guy, if you haven't noticed. But I was also asked by Mr. Liu how old am I? How old am I maturity-wise? I would say I'm between 4 and 15 years old. There is that side of me which is very much childish, childlike, hopefully childlike, if not childish. There's a lot, obviously, in 66 years, there's a lot of stories. There's a bunch. There are, to be perfectly grammatically correct, many stories. But I thought that I would begin by talking about two people who influenced my life in junior high school. One was a guy named Phil Hanley. And if you're in my poetry class, then you know why Phil Hanley was an influence. Phil Hanley was our school hoodlum. Do you know what a hoodlum is? Back in the 60s and the 50s, a hoodlum was a guy who dressed in black and then had a pompadour haircut, which was a haircut that kind of went out and up and was very sculpted and lofty and greasy. And Phil Hanley was the only such person in our junior high school, and he scared us. Everybody was afraid of Phil Hanley. But Phil Hanley distinguished himself particularly in one way. Yes, he had a switchblade, and if he wanted to make the waters of part in junior high school, he would take out his switchblade and just start flicking it. And we were all too terrified to tell on him. And yes, when he came into the bathroom, again, the waters would part as he reached for his comb and went to his mirror of choice to work on his hair. But as I said, what distinguished him really was one day he brought into homeroom a box, a towel-lined box with 3 kittens. And we all oohed and awed at the 3 kittens, and were sort of amazed that perhaps Phil Hanley had a softer side to him. But then after homeroom and before class, he, with a few other homeroom kids trailing him because they were fond of kittens, went into the bathroom and he proceeded to flush the 3 kittens down the toilet. It was like how does this happen in the real world? How can someone do something like that? Obviously, it disturbed the entire school. That was one person, Phil Hanley. I've written, as my creative writing class knows, I have tried to write poems about Phil Hanley probably since junior high school. And just this term wrote something that I think is close to being a finished poem. By the way, I'm Brad Davis. I write poems. I also work at Stony Brook School. The other person, her name was Kathy Byrne. Kathy Byrne was someone who it was sort of like my first crush. We were married on the playground in 5th grade. Then she started hanging around with Teddy Schulhoff, and that presented a problem, for me anyway. And then finally in 7th grade, she was walking to her CCD class at the Roman Catholic Church, her after-school church teaching class. And I came up from behind her, and I excused myself, and this is all very backwards, I know. I asked her if she would go steady with me, which in the old world meant, would you be an item? You know, I would be your special, you would be my special, and this would be cool. And Kathy, we liked each other, but Kathy turned and said to me, you know, I can't. I said, what do you mean you can't? Do you want to? She said, yeah, but that's irrelevant. She didn't actually use the word irrelevant. This was 7th grade. She said, there's a problem. My mother wouldn't allow it. I said, but I know your mom. I come over to your house. We play, we hang out. We're on a swimming team together. We go sledding in the winter together. I mean, our families kind of know each other. She says, yeah, all that's true, and she likes you. But you're a Protestant. And I can't have special relationships with Protestants. I don't know if you're familiar with the history of the relationship between Catholics and Protestants, but it's been an ugly relationship for centuries, and it became personal for me on that afternoon after school in 7th grade. I mentioned both of those two people because Phil Hanley woke me up to evil that was near me, close at hand. And Kathy Byrne woke me up to church history and the legacy of religion in the modern world. And my responses to evil and also the legacy of religion were almost equal and almost equal. I decided that evil was despicable and loathsome, and I didn't want to be a part of it. I failed. But, and then I decided religion was despicable. And if it came between people, it was wrong-headed, and I didn't want to have anything to do with it. I wasn't successful there either. But I wanted to share those people right up front to start, just so you get a little bit of the tension that I experienced that was going on in my life in 7th grade, 7th and 8th grade. And on top of that, there was television. Now, you all take television for granted, but I was part of that generation that first experienced television. And there were some really goofy things we watched. Andy Devine show, which had a character, a little puppet named Froggy, and one named Midnight the Cat, and it was really terrible, but they showed clips of Tarzan the Wonder Boy, and I liked watching the clips of Tarzan the Wonder Boy. But television, which early on in the 50s, 1950s, was geared for, at least at my age, I was born in 52, so it was all entertainment. It was, if we had it in the house, I don't remember when we actually got television, but it was when I was a little kid. Until the 60s, television was simply a means of entertainment. In the 60s, television became almost a universal introduction to horror. And I don't mean horror as a genre. I mean horror as in the Vietnam War, atomic bomb blasts, looking at tests of atomic bombs going off. There's a mass murderer named Richard Speck, which most of you don't know anything about. Richard Speck was a mass murderer, and his story was covered on TV. I mean, it's like you were following a bad TV series live, And then, of course, you had the television brought us assassinations. The Kennedy brothers and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King brought us urban riots and sort of the disintegration of American society in general. Yeah, it brought us the Beatles. And I'm wearing Beatle socks this morning to honor that time in my life. But generally, the television was a minister of kind of despair in the 60s for me. You could say it introduced me to the big bad world. Phil Hanley personalized it, but television universalized it. So by the end of the 60s, I, not being a believer or a religious person at the time, I had sort of given up on religion. I made some very dangerous choices regarding drugs and some pretty angry politics. A friend of mine, this won't mean much to many of you, but there was a radical underground political movement called the Weathermen back in the 60s. And one of my friends was a significant other of one of the Weathermen in Colorado. Sue St. John was my friend, and I was kind of excited by her proximity to radical anti-establishment thinking and acting. It's scary because the Weathermen were a violent organization. They believed in the violent overthrow of the current order. I was angry enough at having to wake up in the 60s and deal with all the crap that the 60s threw at us, that I found Sue St. John's connection to the radical angry people pretty kind of sexy. But I was a coward too, so I didn't make any moves in that direction personally. But when it came time at boarding school, I went to a boarding school, couldn't live with my mother, so my dad had me go to boarding school. And boarding school in the late 60s, when, if you know anything about the history of the Vietnam War, when the bombing of Cambodia occurred, there were student strikes across America and seminars happening on most of the great university campuses. My school, Williston Academy, the students decided that we were going to suspend classes. We did not consult our teachers or the administration. We decided we were going to suspend classes, and we were going to walk 4 miles to Northampton to Smith College, where they were having workshops and concerts and anti-war demonstration. And so 480 of us, one morning, gathered in the quad area of this campus, and we didn't tell anyone. All of us gathered and began walking. To the headmaster's credit, he saw an opportunity. And so he hurried out of his house and led the march. He was a very conservative guy, but he wanted this to look differently than it actually was. Like this was a school-sponsored event. Pretty savvy, I think. So the 60s were not a romantically wonderful, all the music. Yeah, there was good music. If you don't know the Kinks, look into the Kinks. The Kinks are fantastic. There are others as well, but I'm just going to focus on them. By 1970, my anger with American society, militarism, sexism, racism, things that are very close to the heart of what America has been for 200 years. It was all at a fever pitch, and I was self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. And in the middle of my senior year, one night after getting baked, shall we say, stoned, high, I had a conversation with a Korean friend, and at the end of that conversation, I decided that remaining at the school was a farce, that I didn't care about the school, and there were a few people who cared about me, but they didn't really care whether I stayed or went. So in the middle of one February night, I packed my guitar, put a scarf around my neck, and ran away from school. It was really cold for just a scarf, but my concern was less for myself than for my guitar. So after I'd gotten a half a mile away from school, I was in the middle of the town, I realized that the cold was not a good place for the guitar. So I turned around, went back and snuck back into my dorm, put my guitar on my bed where it would stay warm, and then ran away again. And this time I walked through the town, up over the mountain. I was walking on roads, and I got to Route 91, which is the north-south road in New England. And there I sat for a good long time wondering what I was doing, sure that I was making a good choice. This was like the first big choice I'd ever made in my life, like life-determining choice, and I believed it was a good choice. I knew I was messed up by the drugs and the craziness and the anger. I knew I was messed up. I knew that school was I wasn't getting anything out of it. Parenthetical statement, of the 145 seniors, I was number 144. So I was not what you'd call the ideal student. In any case, I'm sitting there by Route 91, I-91, and I realized that I was done trying to fit into everybody else's idea of who I should be. I recognized I had zero motivation for doing anything. I decided that I wanted to live. That was a good choice. But until I could find some deep motivation for doing anything, I was done with America with a K, of course, back then. I was done with affluent white society in which I grew up. It was vapid, empty. Talk about a bubble. Goodness gracious. The world could be burning around you, and my family and many other families would go out to the country club and play a round of golf. You know, talk about fiddling while Rome burns. That was life in New Canaan, Connecticut in the 60s. New Canaan at the time, highest income per capita in America. So we're not talking, there was no richer community in America at the time. More richer? How about more rich? Yeah. So there by Route 91, I decided I wasn't going to do anything, and I began looking for, and this was a phrase that was very deliberate and conscious at the time. I began to wait and look for something more. I was looking for something more, and I wrote songs. Back then I wrote a lot of songs in addition to poems. I wrote a song entitled A Long Suite. It had many parts, and it was called For Something More. I went home. I finally decided to call my parents. They came and picked me up. I went. They sent me to a psychiatrist, an adolescent psych guy, and he was great. His name was Umberto Squattrito, and he had a really deep voice that I loved to listen to. So I used to ask him questions just to get him to talk. And it was during the year that I was at home, because I obviously running away in the middle of my senior year, I'm kind of cooking my college goose right there, right? So I did take a year off. I managed to graduate that spring from my local high school. During that year off, I bumped into some Christians. And I'm really grateful I did not bump into churchy Christians, because I wouldn't have had any time in the world for them. I bumped into a bunch of Christians who were pretty much street-level people. Vietnam veterans who had an equal disdain for American foreign policy. Women who had an even greater disdain for sexism in America. Some African American guys who were militantly opposed to the American racist way, but were deeply committed to following Jesus. Or I should say, and were deeply committed to following Jesus. And these men and women who were older than I deeply impressed me with their intelligence, their passion, and their critique of the world in which we had all grown up. But what was galvanizing for me, what was astounding to me, was their love for this anti-establishment Jewish guy named Jesus. I mean, I had heard about Jesus growing up in the Episcopal Church, but it was like white Jesus in flowing gowns and with trumpets, and many families, those who followed him, were dressed to the nines. You know, but all of a sudden, these people that I started to meet in the early 70s, they introduced me to a Jesus that was actually in the New Testament, not in the Episcopal Church. And it blew my mind. I learned that Jesus was not, for America. He was for the kingdom of God. And therefore, he was against all earthly powers. They showed me Psalm 2, where it says, the nations rage against him. Not one nation is for him. And I began to develop a critique and an understanding based on Jesus that gave me profound motivation. I fell in love with this rabbi, with his teaching, with his willingness to die for me and for others. But most importantly, I was utterly enthralled by his resurrection. Because if God had not raised him from the dead, then the cross was stupid. I know there's a lot of emphasis in both Catholic and Protestant circles on the cross. Fine. But what gives that any meaning whatsoever is the resurrection. If he was not raised from the dead, then the rest of Christianity is a pile of camel dung. But God raised him from the dead. Women testified to it, the first eyewitnesses. And then he appeared to others. He appeared. Wait, this dead guy appeared. I mean, it's a fantastic, it's unbelievable. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. Is it not? Yes. Except that in the economy, the great economy of God, it is the nonsense that makes sense of everything else, if you're paying attention. So I am not a big proponent of religion. Nor am I a big proponent of nation or whatnot. My life since that time and I've not been successful in many ways. I screw up daily, but my life has been about following Jesus, and steeping myself in his teaching, believing that when I listen to Jesus teach and I read about how he behaves in the New Testament, I am seeing into the heart of God. There is no better revelation of the heart and character of God than the person and teaching of Jesus. I have all kinds of respect for people who love to exposit the Old Testament. I have lots of love and respect for people who get all excited about the book of Revelation and all excited about the epistles. But frankly, I'm enthralled with Jesus. So, where am I in my life right now? I'm facing retirement. And I am scared poopless. Some of you know that having grown up in my very liberal environment, I like to paint with all the colors on the palette. I'm holding back. I don't know what's coming next. I have no clue. We've been looking for a house, a condo, and coming up short, 2 days late on things we decide we really like, or the taxes are a few $100s too high, and it's like, oh gosh, this stinks. We don't know where we're going to be next year, but we're leaving in June. And as was said just yesterday in chapel by Andrew, I keep forgetting people's last names. Almost forgot his first name. but we're at a point where we can either collapse into fear and anxiety and everything else, not believing that there's a God or trusting that the God cares for us, or we can choose to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and because he rose from the dead, he is the Lord of all, and as he has loved us in the past, he will continue to love us into the present, and beyond the present into the future. There's my choice, to believe or not to believe. And that, of course, is our choice, isn't it? To believe or not to believe. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, if there's still time, I'm game. Any questions? Don't ask me what I was smoking the night that I ran away. Okay. Actually, you can ask that. But
where does Mrs. Davis come into the story?
oh, yeah. I was really focusing very much on moi. In college, I was a freshman and she was a junior. Because I took so long through high school, 5 years of high school, and then I was exhausted and had to take another year off. So it was crazy. 6 years to get through high school. Be comforted, Max. And so anyway, I got to college, and my first contact with Mrs. Davis, Deb, who at the time went by Debbie, was I saw her, and she had these long curls, like long tendrils, I call them, like looked like an octopusy kind of things just hanging from her head, and she wore all these fancier clothes, and my first impression was, wow, she's way too expensive for me. She may be cute, but she's way too expensive. And so we went our separate ways. And then one day I walked into the dining hall, the student center, and I heard some music playing, and I heard somebody singing. And so I followed the music to where it was happening, and sat at a couple tables away, and she was singing in this band. I noticed they didn't have a lead guitarist. So I said, hey, could I borrow the guitar? I'll just noodle along while you guys, and they said, sure. And so as I'm noodling and they're playing and singing, they get to Roberta Flack's Killing Me Softly. And she starts singing that song. She has a beautiful alto voice. And in my imagination, we were doing this little sort of googly eye thing as she was singing "Killing Me Softly," and my heart's going ba-doom, 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 ba-doom. It was funny. And I continued to noodle, and she continued to sing. At the end of the rehearsal, I asked if I could join the band, and they said, "Yeah, that sounds great." And then I asked her if she'd go out with me that night, and she said, "Sure, that sounds great." And so we went to the basketball game. Halfway through the basketball game, she looks at me, she goes, "I have a date." I said, "Okay, with whom?" And she points to the biggest guy on the basketball court, Lowry McGowan, who was like God on campus. He was this Irish god, and with a long red shag of a haircut and built and this much taller than I. And I said, "Okay, cool. I'll walk you back to the dorm." And so I walked her back to the dorm, and I'm on the steps. She's going up the steps to the dorm. I said, "I'll see you later." And she goes, "Wait a minute. I'll go out with you." I went, "No. I don't want to be Lowry's enemy." She said, "Oh, don't worry. We're just good friends. Not to worry about it." I went, "Fine." And so she and I went out after the halftime, and she stood up Lowry. A few days later, Lowry comes up to me in the student center, and he's towering over me like he goes, "If you hurt her, I'll be after you." And I went, "We're good." I will not hurt her. So that's how we began in college. Yeah.
So if you know me well, you know that I'm very much a music person. So I know you were talking a little bit about the music of the 60s, but like as the music was changing throughout the decades, like how did it influence you? And did you take like any specific artists besides like the Kings to heart? And
Yeah. The question was about music and its role in my development as a human being, sort of. I loved much music. I grew very fond of music that's coming from the fringe, alternative stuff that upset other people. So I loved rock and roll. I loved Woodstock and all of that. And then Parliament and funk in the 70s and some of the crazier experimental stuff that was going on in the 80s. Brian Eno, Roxy Music, and then on into the 90s. I've always been drawn to the fringe, the music of the fringe. That's the general answer. So, yeah, I'm still drawn to that same fringy music.
do you think that says anything about your personality?
Absolutely. I have been a fringy guy. I've been. I wore these sneakers this morning, just because as an emblem. Not in addition to the Beatles socks, I wore my skate shoes because I have from the get-go been a little bit in your face with authority. I have an authority problem. It's been well diagnosed. But then again, I'm happy to worship him to whom all authorities must render account, including the authority of myself, which is so small. Fini? Bye. Oh, question.
I'm just curious, you tell the story. The Christians you met in the Depression, it sounds like, is this part of like the Jesus movement?
Yes, it was. Yeah. There were some major teachers at that time. Tom Skinner was a black preacher at the time that was very influential. There were some musicians. I never got into Christian music. But there were some great teachers. Yeah. Yeah, we were Jesus people, man.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Oh, I also brought, in case you want to know anything about my family, I brought the book. This is actually, yeah, my family. Yeah, this is part of growing up in affluent America, is that my family can trace its roots back to about 1000 AD in Scotland. And this will testify to that. And I'm in here, I think. So anyway, funny. But my one claim to fame is there's this guy named Sylvester Graham, and the graham cracker is attributed to him. Whoa. So yeah, graham cracker is in my blood.